So this is something Keats wrote in 1816 about, or at least published in 1816. Most of you probably know of it. It's called On First Looking into Chapman's Homer. And for people who don't know, Chapman was a poet and a translator who did not the first, but the first really successful translation of the Iliad and the Odyssey into English, and basically translated it into like rhyming, stanzas. I have a copy of it over here I have 3 shelves dedicated to Homeric literature here in my office, by the way. And my copy of Chapman's Homer is over there. So this is what Keats says about the first time that he looked into Chapman's Homer.
Yeah.
Much have I traveled in the realms of gold, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen. Round many western islands I have been, which bards in fealty to Apollo hold. Oft of one wide expanse I had been told, that deep-browed Homer ruled as his demesne. Yet did I never breathe its pure serene, till I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold. Then felt I like some watcher of the skies when a new planet swims into his ken, or like stout Cortez when with eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific, and all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise, silent on a peak in Darien. I love this poem so much. It's one of my favorite poems, probably my favorite of Keats.
And I mean, think about this. Like, I mean, I don't remember Keats's education off the top of my head. I studied a lot of this stuff, like it's been 30 years now. But even if he could read Greek or some Latin version,
he could not read Greek.
Okay. Even if he could, though, like to have something well done in your own language,
for sure.
Like this is also true about worship, about liturgy.
Right.
Like it can be absolutely beautiful in languages that are not your own, including and maybe especially if you speak that language or understand it. But when it is in your language, the language of your heart, the language that you learned at your mother's knee, that gets you. But it has to be very, very well done, especially if it's a translation, which is really hard to do. So this is like a revelation to him.
Yeah.
Like, wow. This,
it's like being an astronomer and suddenly you discover a new planet.
That's what he says.
That's what he says. And I love this idea that he's traveled in the realms of gold, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen. Round many western islands I have been, which bards in fealty to Apollo hold. Apollo is, of course, the god of poetry. So the idea is that all the poems, these works of literature, these are these different kingdoms. And he's this traveler, and he keeps hearing about the land of Homer. But he only hears about it. He never gets to experience it for himself until he finds it in Chapman.
Yeah.
And I mean, this is, if you want to say, like, why should you read this or read old books? I mean, this is one of the reasons. You should feel like when you read Homer that you are discovering a world that is alien to you. And actually, you should be a little ticked off at everyone in the poem, and you should be a little frustrated. And you should feel all of those things. That's the feeling of pride leaving your body, right? Because the thing that you need to feel, I think the Greeks call this that sense like aphoria or something like that. But it's the idea of pride and ignorance leaving your body as you discover a new world. You discover new ways of being a human. You discover new answers to these questions about fate and free will and all these different things. But then what you discover when you come back to it over and over and over again, which I suggest you should do, is you'll begin to see that actually you are Achilles, right? I mean,
right.
I hate complaining. I really, really hate complaining. I do, even though I do so much of it. People complain all the time, it's just about all these angry young men, and what are we going to do with them when they show up to our church and all these different things. Like, man, if you can't love an angry young man, how are you ever going to minister to him? How are you going to show him the gospel? Right. What you're going to discover is that in the characters of the Iliad, you actually run into everyone that you're ever going to meet.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that part of part of what this work does, because I mentioned last time that I read this just for the first time just about a year ago, all the way through. I've read bits before, and so it's an interesting experience, you know, as a guy in my late 40s to come upon this for the first time. And I think that one of the things that this work does is, like you mentioned, angry young men. Okay, so they've got a certain set of feelings that they have that are potentially very dangerous to themselves and other people.
Right.
But we all have various kinds of dangerous feelings going on, and they become harmful if they're acted upon in certain kinds of ways.
Who among us has never had a bad day and you feel like my wife doesn't appreciate me, my kids don't appreciate me, my parents doesn't appreciate me, and I'm going to go and sulk and be like, oh, let's see how you do without my help.
Right. Absolutely.
Come on.
I think one of the things that this poem does, and I mean, I would say all good literature does this, but this one really does it in a very blazing way, is allow you in a displaced way to go through the experience of the rage, of the fear, of the frustration. You know, like it functions in some ways the way that, like, I'm not a big sports ball guy, but like sports is a way of displaced battle.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah.
It's displaced battle. It is still dangerous, but nowhere near as dangerous as a bunch of guys lining up with swords and shields and stuff, sticking each other in the neck. You know, it does some of that same kind of thing. And I think that that's really valuable. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's been so enduring, right? Because that to me is one of the big questions: is why is this Bronze Age piece of literature so enduring? You know, even now, where we're like past all that, like we are one of the most anti-traditional periods in history.
Yeah.
Although I think we're getting over that. Actually,
I have to tell you, there's a lot of wrath and war in the world. I mean.
Yeah.
Listen, if you don't read Homer for anything else, if you could come away from, so we have this narrative that, and we got this, I think, largely from fighting Hitler. Okay, Nazis bad, just putting that out there. Shouldn't need saying. Anyway, but we sort of like got, okay, every war now has to have a good side and a bad side, and everybody on the good side is totally good and everything they do is justified, and everybody on the bad side is totally evil and every one of them is like totally evil to the bone. And it needs to be said that there are a lot of things happening in the world today, and there's a lot of ugliness and things like that, and if you cannot love people on both sides, I'm not saying justify both sides, you know, like the things that you'd have to do in my eyes to justify a war are it's a pretty, you know, the just war list is a very short list for as far as I'm concerned. But what I'm trying to say is that if you can't love people on both sides and you have to think, oh, then they're the problem. If we get those people out of the world, if we get rid of those people, then the world is going to be fixed. Yeah. Right. If you don't read Homer for any other reason, read it so you can learn to love the human race.
Love your enemies. Christ
to love your enemies
says this.
Yeah.
Like, this is still Christian ethics. Love your enemies.
and of course that's like a level beyond it's a level beyond Homer, like obviously what Christ is calling us to. Sure. But you have to start with Homer to sort of say a worthy adversary, or you have to be able to say, you know, sure, on the wrong side of this thing for me, but there's something to admire there, right? If you can't do that, then getting to the love your enemies is going to be really difficult. Yeah.